Good morning, everybody. Allow me to welcome you on behalf of UVU's Center of Constitutional Studies and Utah's America 250 Commission to our annual First Amendment Conference. I'm Sage Kennison. I'm a student here at UVU and a Wood Research Assistant in the center. The theme of this year's conference is A Revolution in Religious Freedom from the Declaration of Independence to the First Amendment. Our sessions throughout the day will carry us from the American Revolution to the current term of the U.S. Supreme Court. Our first session brings together a collection of eminent scholars from history and political thought of the American founding to consider the impact of the American Revolution on religious liberty in our fledgling union. Moderating the panel is Matthew Brogdon, who serves as the Larry H. and Gail Miller Senior Director of the Center for Constitutional Studies. Joining him is Michael Breidenbach. I said that right? Okay, Breidenbach, an associate professor of history at Ave Maria University and author of Our Dear Bought Liberty, Catholics, and Religious Toleration in Early America. Jane Calvert, a director of the Dickinson Writings Project at the University of Delaware and author of Quaker Constitutionalism and Political Thought of John Dickinson, and Troy Smith, a professor and graduate program director in the Constitutional Government, Civics, and Law here at UVU, and editor of Federalism in America, an encyclopedia. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. I have been wanting an opportunity to speak about Dickinson and religious liberty for a very long time now, so I really, really appreciate the opportunity. And I apologize in advance. I'm at the tail end of a cold, so please excuse that. John Dickinson of Delaware and Pennsylvania was America's first celebrity and the internationally recognized spokesman for the American cause before the Declaration of Independence. During the same period, he was also the leading advocate of religious liberty in the colonies. It's no surprise. Dickinson was born and raised in a Quaker family, and although he never became a Quaker himself, he adopted many of their causes, the most important of which was liberty of conscience. Since the Religious Society of Friends arose in the 1650s, members had been engaging in peaceful protest and martyring themselves for the cause, suffering beatings, whippings, brandings, mutilations, imprisonment, and executions at the hands of Anglicans in England and Calvinists in New England. No religious group was as persecuted as the Quakers. Their largest colony, Pennsylvania, was the only major American colony with constitutional protection for religious liberty. Quakers had made this a central provision in their Constitution, the 1701 Charter of Privileges, that existed until 1776. The charter allowed Quakers to exercise all the usual political and civil rights that they were denied in most other areas of the realm. To be clear, however, there was not actual separation of church and state in Pennsylvania. Although it's true that there was no established church, since its founding, it had been governed almost exclusively by Quakers who sought to model it on their meeting or church. The same men who controlled the meeting also controlled the legislative assembly, making it the only true theocracy in America. It just so happened that the Quakers' core theological principle was liberty of conscience. It was, they believed, a gateway belief to becoming a Quaker. There were, however, non-Quakers who resented the imposition of the Quaker faith upon them. For John Dickinson's entire political career before independence, he demonstrated himself a stalwart advocate for religious liberty. I'll describe 4 instances of this advocacy, 3 of which have the Pennsylvania Charter at the center. The first came at the very beginning of his career. Dickinson entered the Pennsylvania legislature in the early 1760s. Already a well-respected lawyer known for taking cases to defend basic rights such as liberty of the press, he soon became embroiled in a political controversy about the Charter of Privileges. In 1764, amid ongoing battles with the Penn family, the owners of Pennsylvania, a faction of the assembly led by Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Galloway sought to abolish the proprietary government and place the colony under the protection of the crown, making it a royal colony. The problem was, as Dickinson saw it, doing so would also abolish the charter. He thus began a counter-campaign to save it, giving a speech in the Assembly that was subsequently published as a pamphlet. He began, "In the first place, we here enjoy that best and greatest of all rights, a perfect religious freedom." The obvious problem, he continued, was if Pennsylvania were to throw themselves on the mercy of the Crown, they would be in no position to dictate the terms of their government. And there was no reason to think that the king would be amenable to allowing Pennsylvanians more liberties than subjects of the Crown had in England. Thus, Quakers in Pennsylvania could again be living under an Anglican establishment. Dickinson reminded them that nowhere else could they hold office, vote, and serve on juries, because here they could take an affirmation rather than an oath, which violated Quakers' faith. Dickinson's speech was praised on both sides of the Atlantic and was a major reason why Pennsylvanians ultimately did not abolish the charter. The second instance comes only 4 years later, when, in the midst of the colonists' resistance to the Townshend Acts, another threat to religious dissenters loomed. Leading members of the Church of England in the colonies began calling for an Anglican bishop to be installed in America. On the lookout for any sign of British encroachments on American rights and liberties, Dickinson took up his pen in what became known as the Episcopal controversy to contribute to the Sentinel Letters. He had just published his most famous work, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, and readers were inspired by his arguments for religious rights to begin applying them to religious liberty. Dickinson contributed 3 or 4 of the 19 Sentinel Letters, making eloquent and persuasive arguments not merely for religious liberty, upholding the Charter of Privileges as a model, but also separation of church and state. Religion and government, he said, are certainly very different things, instituted for different ends. He sounded the alarm about the dangerous interference of an Anglican bishop could exert over colonial affairs and the risks to the consciences of dissenters, which included the majority of the populations of the middle and northern colonies. His voice was soon recognized among the letters, which ultimately were persuasive. No Anglican bishop was installed in America until after the conclusion of the War of Independence. During the tense couple of years immediately before the independence was declared, Dickinson made 2 more significant contributions to the debate over religious liberty, neither of which was successful. The first was during the First Continental Congress of 1774. Delegates from various colonies met to determine how to proceed in the face of the coercive acts passed in response to the Boston Tea Party. At this moment, the agenda that Dickinson had laid out in his farmers' letters prevailed. Congress would work for unity and peaceful protest with the goal of reconciliation with Britain. As part of that unity, Dickinson wanted to invite the province of Quebec in Canada to unite with the other colonies. Given most Americans' hatred of the French, and especially of Catholics, they abhorred the recent Quebec Act that had brought the province into the British Empire. But because of Dickinson's unmatched power and influence at this time, his letter to the inhabitants of the province of Quebec was approved by Congress. It appealed to Quebecois to join with the other British colonies on the basis of religious freedom, of being allowed to practice their Catholicism unmolested by British officials. It was surely a relief to most members of Congress that the letter was ignored. Finally, Dickinson's most dramatic attempt to secure rights of conscience, not merely for Pennsylvanians, but all Americans, came on the eve of independence in June 1776. Dickinson didn't want independence. Among his many concerns about American preparedness was that without the protection of the British Constitution, religious dissenters would be persecuted, particularly Pennsylvania's Quakers. Either way, the Charter of Privileges would be abolished. Then, if the British prevailed in the war, Anglicanism would be imposed. If the Americans prevailed, the Quakers' enemies, the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who were Calvinists, would exact revenge. So when Dickinson was charged with drafting America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, he queried, "Should not the first article provide for a toleration against establishments hereafter to be made?" Then he did something remarkable. He copied the Religious Liberty Clause from the Charter of Privileges. His purpose was to freeze protections for dissenters at current levels in each colony, Thus, although there would be no immediate expansion of religious freedom, neither could dissenters lose protections for their rights. But that wasn't all. As Dickinson began copying the clause, he wrote, "No person or persons in any colony living peaceably under the civil government shall be molested or prejudiced in his or their person or estate." But then he stopped. Something wasn't right. He went back to edit. "No person in any colony living peaceably under the civil government shall be molested or prejudiced," and then he crossed out his or their and wrote in his or her person or estate for his or her religious persuasion. By using gender-inclusive language, he wrote in protections specifically for women, but his actions are more monumental even than that. The clause continues, "for his or her persuasion or practice." The word practice is significant because Quakers were the only religion to allow women to preach. This clause protects not merely women's freedom to assemble and worship, but also their freedom of public speech. Dickinson surely had his female relatives in mind, who were all Quakers, including his wife. I submit that in writing this clause, this was the most revolutionary act of the Revolution. Of course, it was also conservative in that Dickinson was merely trying to protect what already existed in Pennsylvania. But Americans were not ready for religious liberty, to say nothing of women's rights, and this clause was immediately rejected by Congress. Anticipating this failure, Dickinson likewise included the same clause in a new proposal for a Pennsylvania Constitution. But by then, the Patriots, those angry Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, had already taken control of Pennsylvania and were planning a very different approach, to exact revenge against Quakers for their imposition of Quakerism on the people of Pennsylvania. Many of Dickinson's fears about independence were justified. He was most obviously right about the persecution of religious dissenters. Only 1 year later, the Patriots exacted the worst persecution of Quakers in 100 years. Led by Thomas Paine and John Adams, they rounded up the leading Quakers in Philadelphia, several of whom were Dickinson's kinsmen, accused them of treason with fabricated evidence, denied them habeas corpus, and exiled them to Virginia for 9 months, destroying lives and livelihoods. Many more Quakers were harassed in the streets and their property vandalized. 2 were executed. But Americans gradually came around to Dickinson's way of thinking over the course of decades or centuries. In 1791, they ratified the First Amendment to the Constitution. In 1868, the 14th Amendment allowed the first to be gradually incorporated against the states. In the 1970s, states began using gender-neutral language in constitutions. It seems appropriate to end my remarks with an allusion to Scripture. Dickinson's idea for religious liberty was the stone the builders rejected that became a cornerstone of the Republic. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by thanking you all for being here, and to the Center for Constitutional Studies for this invitation for my first visit to Utah. It's been a very warm welcome, so thanks very much. It's also nice to see some friendly faces in the room from my past life at James Madison program. I'm here today to talk about the Catholics at the American founding, and I'm afraid I have more bad news. As Dr. Calvert has just said, Quakers were savagely persecuted throughout their history in England and in the colonies. And something could be said of Catholics as well. In England and the American colonies, many of them at least, Catholics were presumed dangerous until proven loyal. We find that Catholic priests were hunted down in England, bounties on their head. It was illegal for Catholics to hold public office, to worship publicly, for them to send their children to schools. And a lot of those traditions and laws were likewise transplanted into the American colonies. Maryland and Pennsylvania are important exceptions, at least at some point in their colonial history. And yet, when you look at the 18th century, especially in the American founding, we see Catholics who are not just at the table of forming this new American republic, but also shaping religious liberty laws. We have Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who became the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. We have two framers of the Constitution who are Catholic. We have the first bishop, John Carroll, Bishop of Baltimore, who was an avid proponent of the American Revolution and independence, who helped to shape, in his own way as an ecclesiastical superior, the constitutional culture, shall we say. And so if you take sort of the persecution on one end of the ledger and the contributions of Catholics at the American founding on the other, you might wonder what explains this remarkable transformation from going from suspected subjects of a king to trusted citizens of a new republic. In any case, that was the puzzle that I tried to tease out as I set to explore this topic on Catholics and American religious toleration and liberty. And it's helpful, in order to answer that question, to look at the central reason why Catholics were seen to be politically impalatable, right? Why were they not to be tolerated? And you can look at lots of different documents and laws on this question, but the central reason, I argue, is because there was a belief, and the apparent acceptance by Catholics of this belief, that the Pope had certain powers. Among them, he was infallible on spiritual matters, and that he had the power to intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries as well. And if you take those two beliefs, separate them from problems of the Eucharist and the status of Mary and all sorts of theological disputes among Catholics and Protestants, if you just take those two elements of papal authority or perceived papal power, you can see in an instant why Catholics are potentially problematic for an English or colonial state. John Locke, for instance, in his letter concerning toleration, says Catholics can't be tolerated because they deliver themselves up to a foreign prince. And so what this means is that, articulated in many documents from the Holy See and even in practice, what we see is popes apparently annulling civil laws like the Magna Carta. We see popes absolving, apparently, Catholics' duty to their monarch, like Queen Elizabeth I. We have popes attempting to intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries. And any Protestant seeing this would say, well, that is simply unacceptable. You have rendered civil sovereignty a slave to the Pope. And so this was the central reason why Catholics could not be tolerated in the kind of Anglo-American legal body of thought and theory. And so when we look at Catholics presenting themselves at the American founding as not only sort of ones to be tolerated, but actually ones to actually have a seat at the Constitution, for instance, or the Declaration of Independence, we see them having to deal head-on with that central problem. And what I found in my own research is that these Catholics simply said, we don't think the Pope has this power. They denied these two problematic aspects to perceived papal authority. In other words, they denied that the Pope had infallible power by himself. Instead, they believed infallibility rested within a church council, like most recently the Second Vatican Council or the Council of Trent or something like that, when all the bishops come together. So the church itself, they believed it's infallible, but not singly the Pope. And they also believed that under no circumstances does the Pope have the power to intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries, annulling civil laws, absolving citizens of their oaths, or to quote the Oath of Allegiance of 1606 in England, of having the Pope command that citizens murder their king. That was the fear. And not unfounded, because a year before that, Guy Fawkes did try to assassinate the king, and he was Catholic. And that's the reason why we have that Oath of Allegiance. And every person from England wanting to hold public office or sail to the New World had to swear this oath. And so Catholics from the very beginning, the founders of Maryland, the Lords Baltimore, and then later the Carrolls, they simply denied the Pope had this power. They, in other words, emptied the set of reasons politically why Catholics should not be tolerated. So that was their solution. Now, in terms of influence, once they actually sort of went over this hurdle and said, okay, we can be tolerated, they actually went beyond that and said, we don't want just toleration. We want full civil and religious liberty like everyone else. And so there are three ways that they attempted to do this that I'll sketch for you this morning. Number one, if you look at the Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, something that two Catholics were during the convention, I don't have any evidence that they actually had anything to do with Article 6 directly. What we find is Charles Pinckney proposes this no religious test for public office clause. And what we have is Bishop Carroll writing at very opportune times during the Philadelphia Convention, and also during the second ratifying convention for North Carolina. At these moments, Bishop John Carroll is trying to persuade, through newspaper articles anonymously, to support no religious test for public office. That's not so much a direct influence, but so much as it is a kind of confluence, right? Sort of lots of people trying to influence the proceedings, the ratifying convention or the convention itself in 1787. We also have the mere presence of two Catholics during the Constitutional Convention means that if you had prohibited Catholics from holding public office, that would be rather awkward, because there are two Catholics already holding public office. And it would also subvert the will of the representatives in Maryland who sent those, in Maryland and Pennsylvania, who sent those Catholics to the convention. And so for the reasons of federalism, but also for the reasons of the fact that Catholics were already holding public office in certain states, it meant that to continue the long-standing tradition of prohibiting Catholics from holding public office, which continued in many states and even in England after 1787, would make that unintelligible for the American constitutional order. The second example I want to give is the Establishment Clause. Lots of volumes have been written about the original meaning of the Establishment Clause. In its most, I think, persuasive reading and the most minimal reading, it's that you shouldn't basically create a Church of the United States, akin to a kind of Anglican church in England. If that's a compelling reason or reading of that clause, I think we can say that one of the generating histories that we get from the Congresses before 1787 was that there was a moment when the papal nuncios wanted to have the Annapolis Congress confirm John Carroll as a Catholic bishop. And Benjamin Franklin, who received this missive from the papal nuncio, kind of like an ambassador for the Pope, said, "You don't understand, Congress has no authority over these matters." And the Pope said, the papal representative said, no, please send it to Congress. So Franklin did, and Congress wrote in its first, as far as I can tell, its first missive on church-state relations, said that the Congress does not have jurisdiction over authority about ecclesiastical matters. So even before we get a First Amendment, we have a definitive declaration by the Annapolis Congress that shows that that jurisdiction is reserved for the states. And so Carroll could be confirmed without the approval of Congress. The final example is the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. And here we have Daniel Carroll, who's supporting it. He's the only person, this is a Catholic, the only person who supported the First Amendment unambiguously, as James Madison wrote it in the Free Exercise and Establishment Clause. He said it was the amendment that he thought would reconcile, the best amendment that he thought would reconcile most people to the Constitution. So if you look at that paragraph in what became the official record of the Constitutional Register, the author, Thomas Lloyd, presents Carroll as a kind of order almost. He gives them a kind of pride and place in that record. And so he's the only congressman to unambiguously support the amendment and thought that it was a good idea to pass. What I found is that the official recorder of these debates was a man named Thomas Lloyd. He was Catholic, and he was actually educated by Bishop John Carroll himself while they were in France. And so I'd want to submit is any time we look at sort of the generating history of the First Amendment, we are looking at through the eyes of a Catholic who first recorded those words. And we see him privileging his fellow Catholic in presenting Daniel Carroll's remarks as something set apart from the others. So we're not suggesting here that the Catholic influence was the only one. There were Enlightenment ideas, Protestant theologies, natural rights theory, and so on. But none of those fully explain why Catholics were not only just at the table, but also helped to shape the American constitutional order. And it's for the Catholics' double denial of papal authority, of certain papal authority, that we find them being able to present themselves as good Americans, and then their approach to the First Amendment that made Catholics part of the table. So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brogdon and the Center for Constitutional Studies for the opportunity to be here. Also, the panelists for their insightful presentations, and to all of you for coming out today. I'm going to talk about the covenant tradition in the American founding. The general story of America's constitutional founding emphasizes its secular roots, first liberal and then Republican. Often lost in the telling are the religious roots of the American Republic, specifically covenants theory's profound influence in shaping the American constitutional regime. Consider the following. Most of the immigrant groups to colonial America were founded in covenant philosophy. Those groups emigrated to America to escape the top-down, centralized government control that opposed covenant groups. The Mayflower Compact, which was known by its signers as a covenant, was but the first of many political covenants these emigrant groups signed their names to in order to establish political societies in the New World. Andrew McLaughlin's study of the foundations of American constitutionalism found covenant thinking everywhere in colonial America as the foundational principle for social and political organization. Donald Lutz found the book cited most often between 1760 and 1805 on politics was the Bible, specifically the sections about covenants and God's promises to Israel. Deuteronomy is cited almost twice as often as Locke's writings put together. Citations of Locke were highest in the 1760s and 1770s and declined drastically thereafter. Biblical citations peaked in the 1770s. The prominence of ministers in the political literature of their day attests to the continuing influence of religion during the founding era. Covenant theory was strongly reinforced in America by Scottish college graduates who emigrated to America and became influential leaders and teachers, such as John Witherspoon, who became the president of Princeton, tutor of James Madison, and signer of the Declaration of Independence. By 1776, formal covenant theory was dead, but covenant ideas and practices were deeply embedded in American culture. One study of religious congregations present in America in 1776 found that covenant was an important and well-understood concept in about 64% of all American religious congregations, including Baptist, Congregationalist, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, Huguenots, Jews, many Presbyterians, though many were not descendants of Scottish Covenanters, and Sandemanians. So for nearly 170 years, from the Mayflower Compact to the Constitution, American colonists experimented with covenants to found and order their societies. These were called federal, from the Latin word feudus, meaning treaty, pact, or covenant. Hence, federalism and federalist are rooted in covenant theory. The people of Massachusetts in 1788 described their Constitution, like their Pilgrim forebears, as a covenant. Hamilton and Madison both referred to the Constitution as a compact, which was covenantal language in their day, emphasizing mutual agreements and responsibilities. In short, covenant theory exerted a profound influence on the founding generation's thinking about government and political order. What specifically did covenant philosophy contribute to America's constitutional order? Here's a few. The concept of popular sovereignty, that is, the supreme authority to rule resides not in the rulers, but in the people. The need for a constitution to maintain social order. Dividing powers within every level of political organization. Checks and balances between institutions. Equality before the law. Separating civil and ecclesiastical powers. Expecting the people to vigilantly monitor their government. Expecting government officials to hear and honor minority views. Granting the people a right to revolution if the leaders or organization violates the covenant and abuses its powers. That's right, a right to revolution was not original with John Locke. In contrast to social contract theory, which sees political agreements as pragmatic arrangements to preserve individual rights, covenant theory imbues political agreements with moral and ethical weight. This ethical dimension fortifies republicanism by aligning it with a higher moral purpose, and it contributes to the moral underpinnings of the Constitution, emphasizing that social agreements are not just pragmatic protections of individual rights, but moral commitments. And lawmakers and citizens alike have a duty to act virtuously and uphold justice. During the colonial period and leading up to the founding, liberal and Republican ideas were mixed into American political thinking, but many of those secular philosophies were covenantally based, including the philosophies of Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Harrington, Grotius, Spinoza, and others. So that's some of the contributions. How do covenants actually work? How do they found and order political society? Let me give you a few basics on this. Covenantalism has two foundational premises. First, human nature contains a mixture of good and evil. Consequently, chaos is likely to reign without some unifying element, connecting and restraining people. The unifying element is a voluntary agreement or covenant, either tacit or explicit, that joins independent individuals or groups into relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity. The second foundational premise of covenantalism is human equality. To respect that equality, power is divided and shared, participants are partners, and rule is based on persuasion. In contrast, sovereign rule is based on inequality characterized by superior subordinate relationships that rule from commands and obedience. A primary value or objective of covenantalism is freedom. By grounding covenant governance in equality and shared rule between partners, covenants privilege and protect the partners' freedoms in two ways. First, covenants limit each party's natural powers. Thus, even God, in covenanting with humans, agrees to constrain his power in order to preserve human liberty. Second, covenants foster collective actions that create the conditions whereby one may live without constant fear for their security and safety, and may use their freedom as they deem best for themselves, their family, and community. Consistent with classic liberalism, covenant philosophy holds that the proper form of rule between humans is based on equality and with a commitment to protecting individual liberty. Consistent with classical republicanism, covenants result in moral obligations and responsibilities to benefit the collective good and in civic virtues. The result of covenant order is a society that provides shared rule over common issues and problems while protecting self-rule and independence. Covenants create a duality. On the one side, people mutually consent to moral obligations that forms the communal identity, and on the other side, individual freedom is protected via government by consent, limited government, equality before the law, and individual rights. Covenants, in short, harmonize an individual's competing needs to both belong and for independence. With that understanding, let me turn specifically to the American founding in relation to covenantalism. First, covenantal thinking created an American national identity based on an ethical principle of justice, founded in consent of the governed, equality before the law, and the protection of individual rights. That helped define the American identity. Second, the Declaration and the Constitution adopt covenant conventions. The Declaration is written in the same format as a covenant. It creates the American people as a people, equal to each other and others, via the phrase, "It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them." So in the Declaration structure, in its definition of one people, combining them together, separate and equal, these are covenantal ideas. The Constitution similarly begins, "We the people," confirming the Declaration's one people, and joining them into a collective agreement with stated objectives found in the preamble: justice, tranquility, defense, welfare, liberty. These reflect mutual commitments akin to those found in a covenant, and it creates a federal or covenantal structure of shared rule and self-rule. Third, social contract theory borrowed heavily from covenant theory, but the one concept in my above list of the covenant's contributions to the Constitution that is most directly tied to covenant theory is the idea that there are distinct spheres of authority to prevent corruption of a political institution by religious influence. The First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which prohibits the establishment of a state religion, reflects this covenantal insistence on maintaining a moral and ethical separation between church and state. Fourth, America's federal union and republican form of government were created and sustained by a culture of covenantalism. Consider in contrast federal countries in Latin America that were colonized by non-covenantal Roman Catholic political systems and peoples. Those have been much less republican and much less successful. Covenantalism's influence has survived long after the founding. For example, Charles Beard wrote positively about covenants in 1944, saying, among other things, "The bond of our covenant is the principle of constitutional government." President Lyndon Johnson, in signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, declared, "This law is a realization of the promise of our Constitution. It is a pledge to the American people that the system will not be upset, that the covenant which has bound us together as a nation will not be broken." The story of America's founding is increasingly told in a secular voice, but many of the founding principles of American constitutionalism, such as the structure of our government, its emphasis on equality before the law, individual rights, republican ethics, civic virtues, and the underlying objective of e pluribus unum, out of many one, are thoroughly covenantal. I'll conclude with one final thought on the implications and the understanding of covenant, of the implication of understanding the Constitution through a covenantal lens. Covenants paint in general principles, not bright lines. That generality can provide the simple rules that foster the emergence of complex, spontaneous orders, in contrast to progressivism's technocratic top-down rule. But that's a discussion for another day. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for giving us these perspectives on the origins of our commitment as a people to religious liberty and the practices and institutions that mark that. It's really helpful to see, for me, the sort of range of traditions that are contributing to that. And the first question I'd like to ask the panel, ask you all to respond to, has to do with the multiple traditions. We've spoken of the Catholic contribution, the Quaker political culture and the experience of Quakers in America contributing to their view, the particular contributions of the covenantal outlook on politics and theology. Maybe you could comment on what is the importance, or where do you see the importance of these particular religious traditions being embedded in or working out their ideas about politics and justice and piety in a political order that is pluralistic, that is, where they don't dominate or often can't. So maybe what is the effect from the perspective of these traditions of being in community with people who are outside those traditions? You just take them as you. Jane, you want to lead off?
That's a great question. And I will say that Quakers kind of flourished in that environment. They, when they first arose in the 1650s and 60s, 70s, 80s, they were, well, initially they were sort of out to convince, they didn't believe in conversion, they would convince the whole world to become Quaker. They went to the far reaches of the globe to do that. Quakers traveled to Rome to convince the Pope. That didn't really go very well. They at least sent missives to China to convince the emperor, to Turkey to convince the Sultan. But they realized that was probably an unrealistic goal, and so they contented themselves later with simply convincing people to act like Quakers. And so they did not mind that people, didn't actually become formal members as long as they shared the Quakers' values. So that actually made them have a farther reach than some of their, more rigid counterparts like Calvinist types. Of course, the Puritans in New England, if you did not agree with, agree with Puritanism and did not sort of go along with their laws, you would be, banished or executed. And Quakers, by contrast, they sort of they might disown somebody from the meeting, but they would never give up on that individual, and they would always send Quakers back to meet with this person. This is why they didn't believe in capital punishment, because they wanted to give every individual a chance to redeem him or herself and possibly become more Quaker-like or even Quaker. And it made them have, excellent relationships with Native Americans whose theology agreed quite strongly with theirs. And so, diversity in that sense was, kind of a core value of Quakerism, because they believed that God could speak and would speak through the most unlikely individuals, and it didn't matter whether that individual called him or herself a Quaker. So, yeah, it was a good environment for Quakers.
Well, the Roman Catholics during this time, and obviously before and even now, consider their religion to be evangelical. In other words, to go to all nations and spread the gospel. The Catholics style themselves as the universal church, members of the universal church. And so you might expect American Catholics to have a similar kind of missionary outlook. And indeed, from the very beginning, with regard to New Spain and New France, and then, of course, in England, you have that kind of missionary approach. And yet, what we find in Maryland, the first colony that Catholics substantially immigrate to, the founder of that colony was George Calvert and his son Cecil Calvert. And we find in their writings the particular care in which they wanted Catholics to have relations with Protestants. in a letter written to his brother, Cecil, who became governor, Cecil Calvert, the proprietor, the owner of Maryland, says to be as peaceable as possible, both at sea and on land, with your Protestant brethren. And when they finally land in what they call Maryland, which was named after a Catholic queen of a Protestant king, the Catholics celebrate Mass on one side and Protestants celebrate their service elsewhere. And so the Act Concerning Toleration in Maryland in 1648 was one of the first systematic toleration acts in English, in the English Empire. And again, affording all Trinitarian Christians toleration as long as you don't blaspheme and you go to Mass and you don't drink to drunkenness and so on, and you are loyal to the proprietor. So what we find here is that Catholics are very careful from the very beginning not to step on anyone's toes as much as possible. They recognize that this is not the kind of establishment that we have in France and Spain and other Catholic countries. They can't rely, even though they have a Catholic proprietor, they can't rely on the state to fully support the Catholic Church in terms of funding, preferential treatment, and so on. So even under a Catholic proprietor. And then, of course, as a minority, they're in no position to dictate. And so what we find, even in sort of ordinary things like marriages, Catholic priests are very willing, actually, given the circumstances, to allow for mixed marriages, right? Protestants and Catholic marriages, which would be seen with askance in Europe. And so there's a great deal of, let's call it pragmatism, I think, among Catholics at the American founding and in the colonial era beforehand.
So the role of pluralism in shaping how they thought, that's a great question. I think it's the nature of humans and human organizations that when they aren't competing or contested by others, they reinforce their own beliefs as the way to be. And so you see this with the Mayflower Compact, Plymouth Rock. There's just, I can't remember if the separatists, the religious group, is a majority or a slight minority, but there's a lot of people on the Mayflower who are not part of that religion. And at Plymouth Rock, they establish freedom of religion. They protect freedom of religion. Whereas 40 miles away, a decade later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded by a similar religious group, but doesn't have outsiders in it, becomes very dogmatic in their way of interpreting things. So I do think that the pluralism that exists in the United States becomes very important for helping to justify, right, the role of the Roman Catholics in promoting that seems like a very important role in religious freedom. I just note that those differences aren't just religious, they're also cultural. And so one group of scholars who look at this suggests that the New England area has a moralistic culture, and that would be more where the Covenant group comes from. The mid-Atlantic states are more individualistic. That's Maryland, where the Roman Catholics end up settling. And then you have a traditionalist culture that puts a lot of emphasis on the elites in shaping society. And so that also contributes to the pluralism.
So I'm interested in exploring I don't know if it's fair to call it a radical change, but a significant shift in American political institutions and sort of the practices of American political communities between the Revolution and the time that the First Amendment is written in 1789. We've got it's about a 13-year period. And it seems to be the case that Americans went from a prevailing practice of some form of religious establishment in most of the colonies. Aside from Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, the colonies overwhelmingly had some sort of approach to religious establishment. Some of those were more pluralistic than others. Some encompassed multiple religions or established churches at a local level. And there were groups like Quakers, to tout my own religious traditions, the Baptists were in there, campaigning vigorously for the idea of a robust religious toleration and a separation of ecclesiastical and political authority. But those groups were by no means a majority. I mean, what's clear as we're talking about this, the groups who were loudest in favor of these principles of free exercise of religion and disestablishment as they come out in the First Amendment, are nowhere near a majority. So how do we move from what is clearly a marginal view among Americans in the 1770s to something that can command the kind of consensus that can result in the First Amendment? How do we make that movement? What happens? How do Quakers persuade the rest of America to adopt these principles? Or do they? Maybe it's more complicated than that.
Well, I think that it's a great question, and I mean, the way Quakers historically persuaded non-Quakers to join their cause, and beginning with religious liberty, was that they would be martyred, and they would sort of allow themselves, they would do things out in the open that would provoke persecution. And the effect of that was that it would as they were literally going to the gallows for their faith, bystanders would look and say, "My goodness, this person really believes this. This is very serious," and they would win converts that way. And I know that the persecution of Quakers in Pennsylvania was noticed. And Thomas Jefferson wrote about it. Maybe not, I don't know that he was speaking specifically about the Virginia exiles, but he wrote about the persecution of Quakers as, making his case for religious liberty. So yeah, I think the Quakers just doing what they did and serving as an example of standing for religious liberty still was having the effect of convincing people to their cause.
I would make a plug for an edited volume by Jonathan Den Hartog and Carl Esbeck on disestablishment. They collected every chapter is a different state or territory that traces the story of disestablishment in each of those states and territories. So it's a complicated set of arrangements, and each state has a different story to tell about disestablishment. The chapter I contributed was on Maryland, and in Maryland, in some ways, they could claim, I think justly, that in the Revolutionary period, we get the 1776 Constitution in Maryland, is not a revolutionary constitution as much as is one that goes back to some original principles of the Maryland Charter. So that's kind of on of the many ways that you can read the Revolution is more of the sort of going back to the charters, right? The reform rather than revolution. And I think that's probably overstated, but in the case of religious liberty, I think there's some ground to say that the lack of establishment at the very beginning of Maryland, the general toleration for Trinitarian Christians, is something that was, among many of the drafters of the Maryland Constitution, wanted to be reinstated after the Anglican establishment in the late 17th century had changed that to Anglicanism. So I sort of read that, at least in some states, as a reform back to the original charter in some cases. The other thing I would say, just on the general sense of disestablishment, I mean, the Anglican Church had several establishments, so basically the majority among the 13 original colonies. But it's a rather awkward position that they're in the Revolution, given that all their bishops have to swear an oath to the king, that their priests are sort of, a kind of priest of not only a church, but also a state. And so they have their own work to do to figure out how they're going to legitimately claim to be Episcopalian, as they call it now, but also good Americans. And so the bishop controversy that Dr. Calvert enumerated continues throughout the colonial experience, and then afterwards they have to find an alternate way to find a bishop, and they do go through the Scottish non-juror tradition, which is to say the bishops who refuse to swear an oath to a king And that's the tradition that Samuel Seabury uses, because you have to find a bishop in the Anglican Communion that doesn't swear an oath to the king as an American, right? So I think this establishment, in terms of the severing of the colony, is both a problem for the Anglican Church, but also a problem for the American state, of how you're going to allow for these different religions that have different authorities that are sometimes foreign, in the case of Catholics and Anglicans.
How do we get from strong religious traditions to the First Amendment's religious provisions? I would say three things: federalism, culture, and the limited application of the First Amendment. First, federalism. Federalism, remember, is shared rule and self-rule. It's a limited commitment that joins the nation together in a national identity, and leaving freedom for the others to decide how they want to be, right? So culture would be, you have the social contract theory of independence and Locke's letter of toleration, which leads to the idea of separation of church and state. And you also have, within the covenant tradition, the idea of separating political and ecclesiastical powers. Those cultures allow for the idea that we should have, at the national level, a limited agreement that there will be no religious establishment, but the states will be able to do their own thing, right? And that's the limited applicability of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law, but it still allows the states to have establishments of religions. And I think, right, the last two states, South Carolina and Massachusetts, give up their established church in the 1830s. So I think federalism allows them to unite around the idea that we're going to have religious freedom nationally, and the culture helps support that, but then the limited applicability of the First Amendment allows for there to be the states to have what they want.
This is a fascinating observation, that it's not just that the federal government disclaims any control over religion, which might have been the case to avoid interfering with local religious establishments. That's kind of the very minimalist reading of the Establishment Clause that Michael, you were talking about. But the remarkable thing is that in the context of that federal non-interference in religion, we actually get states on their own, because of some change in political culture, public opinion, political circumstances, relinquishing their religious establishments willingly. That's going on before the First Amendment's passed, and it continues, so that without any interference from the Supreme Court, any federal civil rights laws, any of the things that we usually associate with bringing about national uniformity on some kind of civil rights issue or civil liberties issue, without any of those things, we get a kind of national trend, a kind of uniformity that prevails. I can't help but think part of the explanation for that, sort of adding these up, is also that whereas the colonies had a kind of character, right? New England had this kind of Calvinist covenantal character. Pennsylvania had this, sort of collection of dissenting traditions, occupying it. Maryland with its Catholics, the southern states with their Anglicans. Those general characterizations tend to begin to disintegrate a little bit as we move into a federal system, and people move, right? We become in some respects one nation, most importantly economically, a commercial republic, where people move across the country and interact in ways that aren't driven by their cultural attachments and religious traditions, but become detached from those things. And so we get the kind of collection of colonies that have a religious character, a kind of pluralism a kind of plural federalism becomes a more pluralistic political culture at the local level. Is that an accurate description of what's happening in the early republic, or is there some other explanation?
If I may, I think the picture becomes increasingly complicated as soon as the First Amendment is passed, right? So and ratified. So I'm thinking of an example called the Civilization Fund. This was a congressionally appropriated fund that President George Washington had control over with the Secretary of State, who at the time was Madison. And he could use this fund in order to, as they said, civilize Native Americans in American territory. The federal government paid Protestant ministers and Catholic priests, the federal government paid these ministers in order to civilize Native Americans. But of course, the ministers and the priests were also intending to evangelize them, to convert them to Christianity. And so we get these funny sort of examples not too long after the revolution, where today we would think, well, that seems, I mean, some people would say that seems like an establishment. That seems like an undue sort of interference, right, in civil affairs, or religious affairs, rather, spending federal money. So that's even on the principle of federalism, right? These are federal funds. And so I think the picture is really complicated, in other words. And I think there are lots of other examples that we could provide.
So I'd like to take an opportunity to turn it over for some questions from the audience at this point. We have a microphone, I think, that we can, we got to steal the one from the podium. Okay.
Are you sure? I can just take the
Troy, yes.
podium from it so that you can.
Okay, so if you have a question, there's one down front to the left there.
Thanks so much. I really appreciated those remarks. I learned a lot. I have two quick factual questions for Michael Breidenbach, and then another question for Troy Smith. Michael, I'd love to know who the two Catholics were in the Constitutional Convention. And second of all, this argument of the American Catholics that the authority for Catholics derives from councils, conciliar authority, not the Pope, as an argument against any notion of the infallibility of papal pronouncements. That's actually not how the Pope's authority is understood today, is it? I mean, the Pope has made infallible proclamations, not very many, 2 or 3 in the history of the Church, I think. But anyway, I'd be interested to see how the American Catholics somehow came to terms with the Catholic Church's continued insistence on papal authority in some dimension. And for Troy, your case is, you made a good case for how covenantal thinking influenced both the Declaration and the Constitution. I'd like to hear what you have to say about what distinguishes them, because when you read the political thought of the founders, for example, Federalist Papers, Washington, Hamilton, and the rest of them, you rarely, if ever, find the word covenant. You will find the word social contract in some instances. So why did the language of covenantal thinking drop off at the time of the founding itself?
Well, thank you, Brad, for those two questions. Daniel Carroll of Maryland and Thomas Fitzsimmons of Pennsylvania were the two constitutional framers who were Catholic. The question about papal infallibility is a good one, because anyone who reads this First Vatican Council in the 19th century will see a definitive declaration of papal infallibility. And so the solution, you might say, that the 18th century American Catholics, and before them the English Catholics and so on, is no longer available to them if you want to be a sort of faithful Catholic who accepts on even conciliarist grounds, right, the conciliar tradition of infallibility resting on councils. It's ineligible to say that the Pope is not infallible by himself. The Pope is infallible with his other bishops, right? And so this presents a you might call it a particular problem to this, let's call it the American Catholic settlement, right? One way to address that issue is to understand how non-Catholics understood this idea of papal infallibility. They understood it as basically almost anything the Pope says in the context of spiritual matters. Or spiritual matters even have to do with temporal affairs. So for instance, there's discussion I've detected about people worrying that if a Pope says, for instance, in a papal bull that's a document called Inter Carita, that the Pope basically divides the world into Spanish and Portuguese territory for missionary work. And anyone who abrogates that will be excommunicated and face damnation, effectively. That makes English colonies particularly problematic, right? Because that should be Spanish territory. Okay, so is that infallible? So there's big questions, and that's the reason why First Vatican Council defined it. So the problem with papal infallibility, according to many Protestants, is that it's very expansive. It could be any papal pronouncement, and extremely sort of doctrinal. In other words, like you must, upon penalty of eternal damnation, accept it. In the 19th century, that's not the Declaration's definition. It's very specific circumstances. And so in some ways, the First Vatican Council allieves a lot of the concern that Protestants and others might have about Catholics. As you mentioned, papal infallibility has been sort of mentioned a few times, and it's about the doctrine concerning Mary. So not very political. And so I think Catholics today could just say, well, it's not really a problem. And it's not the kind of doctrine you imagined having to get into politics.
Thanks for the question. It's why don't we see covenant explicitly in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution debates? There is an evolution of the terms. We call the Mayflower Agreement the Mayflower Compact. It would have been known to the signers as the Mayflower Covenant. The term changes. Covenant becomes understood as an agreement between humans and God. And then they change that, so that's with the Mayflower Covenant, right? It's really between humans with God as a witness. And so later they changed the language to compact as between humans with God as a witness. And then later it becomes contract, which is an agreement between humans without God involved in any way. So by the time, and I mentioned in my comments that formal covenant theory in America was dead by 1776. There's really nobody that's espousing that. But covenant is deeply embedded in the culture, but they're speaking in different terms. They're speaking in compact. So both Madison and Hamilton in number 22 in an interesting paragraph, refer to it as a compact by which we are bound. So I actually find Hamilton's idea of the Constitution as a compact that binds us that we can't get out of very similar to Lincoln's idea of why the southern states can't secede. But it's a different terminology that you have to see.
Other questions from the audience?
Thank you all. This question is for Dr. Calvert. If you wouldn't mind speaking or clarifying for me, you mentioned John Adams' role in the persecution of Quakers. And I recalled that we were talking about Pennsylvania, and I thought, well, how was John Adams involved in Pennsylvania? But perhaps you were speaking of Massachusetts. If you could speak more broadly about his role, what office he was holding, or his participation, was it through influence or other things? I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Right. So this was in 1777, and Adams was in Philadelphia in Congress. And for a couple of years, since about the spring of 1776, Thomas Paine he began his campaign against the Quakers because the Quakers controlled the Pennsylvania government, and the Pennsylvania government was not going to acquiesce to any Declaration of Independence. And so Paine started vilifying the Quakers in the spring of 1776. And then at some point, and he continued to do that, in the crisis, and calling, basically blaming Quakers for the Americans failing to prosecute the war effectively, because Quakers, of course, were pacifists, and Paine knew precisely that the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians in Pennsylvania were the reason they were so angry with the Quakers is because Quakers had imposed pacifism on Pennsylvania and had refused to defend the frontier against Indian attacks, and so the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians were the ones who bore the brunt of that. So Paine knew that whipping them up would be a good way to overthrow the Pennsylvania government, and Paine continued to do that. So then in late summer 1777, these Quaker papers materialized. It turns out that they were actually forgeries from a fictitious Quaker meeting that was being called the Spanktown meeting, and so these papers allegedly showed Quakers conspiring with the British. They were forgeries. There was nothing to them, but so Congress, with Adams was on a committee, and I can't remember the name of the committee, basically in charge of dealing with this. And so, with John Adams' leadership, Congress demanded that the Pennsylvania government, that was now the Revolutionary government, composed of many of Quakers' enemies, arrest the leading Quakers. And so they did. They rounded them up, and there were no charges ever formally made, and the Quakers were in a position where they would, they would petition the Pennsylvania government to say, hey, we're being held without charge. We demand, habeas corpus and all this. And the Pennsylvania government would say, well, we didn't arrest you. That was Congress that wanted that done. And then so they would petition Congress, and Congress said, I don't know, it was a Pennsylvania government that did it. And so this kind of went along for the 9 months. But yeah, John Adams and Samuel Adams too. Really had some just really vitriolic things to say about Quakers. Adams had been sort of humiliated by Quakers when they during the first Congress, when the Massachusetts delegates were basically summoned to a meeting with Quakers, and the Quakers kind of upbraided them for not allowing religious freedom for Baptists in Massachusetts. And so the Adams cousins really sort of hated the Quakers from, and look, that's, it was sort of the old, there were no more Puritans at the time. Yes, the sort of covenantal theology was sort of on the way out, but the culture still remained. And actually, I would say to your question about like sort of the pluralism, I think it absolutely, sort of, there was sort of a pluralism, but it took decades, maybe even centuries, for sort of the cultural characteristics of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania to sort of mellow, and for a long time there was still hostility between the descendants of Puritans in New England and actual Quakers in the middle colonies or middle states. But yeah, John Adams was kind of like right at, and of course he also knew that Dickinson was his main nemesis, and he thought Dickinson was a Quaker, as many people did, and hated that his wife had such influence on him, and that's a whole other thing. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
Well, I am delighted and humbled to have had such tremendous colleagues and scholars to join us to have this discussion. I want to thank our audience for joining us. We're just about at the end of our first session. I want to give you a bit of a preview of what remains today. We will, 15 minutes after this session ends at 11:30, have a 1-hour session on God and the Declaration of Independence. Here's some different perspectives on the degree to which we ought to understand the Declaration of Independence as advancing a religious claim or a secular one, which is, of course, always of ongoing importance to us. And then at the end of the day today, from 2:30 to 3:45, there will be a panel in this room as well on a pending case at the Supreme Court on the question of whether charter schools, public charter schools, can be religious. It's a case coming out of Oklahoma. It's of tremendous current importance. I will say a quick word We're grateful you've joined us for this because this is part of the Center for Constitutional Studies and UVU's commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, you all know that the Declaration was written in 1776, not 1775. But as this panel makes clear, that was a process. The American Revolution, both in ideas and in forms of government, was a thing that played out over time and began well before the Declaration of Independence was written and extended well after it, right down indeed to our own First Amendment and our Bill of Rights, and more than that even. So we're grateful you've joined us for this. We're going to have a lot more programming, not just today, but in the coming year as we go through 2025 and 26. So I hope you will visit our events page, find a good reason to come join us for our other events and benefit from the voices, the plural voices that we have and perspectives that we have coming to campus to inform us about our constitutional inheritance and help us understand how to preserve and improve it. Also want to put you to our podcast, This Constitution. That's been popping up on screens all day. You can find it on Spotify. And I'm not just telling you that because I'm one of the co-hosts, but because I hope you can learn a great deal more about our constitutional tradition from it. Indeed, I think we'll be recording an episode with Jane this afternoon. So thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you at our other sessions.